The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering against the windows of the small cabin nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. Michael Reed sat in his worn leather chair, the one he'd bought at a thrift store in Spokane 3 years ago when he first moved out here, seeking silence and solitude after 2 tours in Afghanistan had left him with memories that wouldn't fade and a nervous system that refused to calm. The chair creaked beneath his weight as he shifted, trying to focus on the book in his hands, but the words blurred together on the page. They always did when the rain fell this hard. It reminded him too much of monsoon season in Kandahar, of nights spent in guard towers watching shadows move through walls of water, never knowing if what he saw was real or just his mind playing tricks after too many sleepless hours. Beside him, stretched out on the braided rug his sister had made for him as a housewarming gift, lay Sargent, a German shepherd mix with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that showed patches of gray around the muzzle despite being only 6 years old. The dog had been a gift, too, though not the kind wrapped in paper and ribbons. Sargent had shown up at a VA support group meeting 18 months ago, part of a service dog program designed to help veterans transition back to civilian life. Michael had resisted at first, insisting he didn't need help, didn't need company, didn't need anything but the quiet of these mountains and the distance from a world that had never quite made sense to him even before the war. But Sargent had been persistent in that way dogs have, pressing his head against Michael's knee during that first meeting, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to understand things words could never capture. Now, Michael couldn't imagine his life without the dog. Sargent had become more than a companion. He was an anchor, a reason to get up in the morning, a presence that filled the silence without demanding conversation. The dog's routines had become Michael's routines. Wake at dawn, no matter how little sleep the night had brought. Walk the perimeter of the property, checking the fence line, breathing in the pine-scented air, feed Sargent, then make coffee. Sit on the porch when weather permitted, watching the light change across the valley below. Simple things, quiet things, things that kept the darkness at bay. But tonight, something felt different. Michael had noticed it even before the rain started. Back when the afternoon sun was still struggling through gathering clouds, Sargent had been restless, pacing from window to window, ears pricked forward, body tense with an alertness that Michael recognized from their training sessions. It was the posture of a dog who had detected something wrong, something out of place, something that required attention. Michael had checked the usual suspects. Bears sometimes wandered through this area, and mountain lions weren't unheard of, though they typically gave human habitations a wide berth. He'd scanned the tree line with his binoculars, seeing nothing but Douglas firs and western red cedars swaying in the rising wind. He'd checked the game camera he'd mounted on a post near the driveway, the one that was supposed to capture any wildlife that came too close. Nothing, just footage of a family of deer that had passed through around noon, and a raven that had landed on the camera itself, peering into the lens with what looked like curiosity before flying away. Now, with night fully settled and the rain creating a curtain between the cabin and the rest of the world, Sargent's agitation had only increased. The dog stood suddenly, the movement so abrupt that Michael set his book aside and leaned forward in his chair. Sargent was staring at the window that faced east, toward the densest part of the forest that covered the slope behind the cabin. His ears were forward, his tail rigid, and a low rumble had started in his chest. The kind of growl that meant business, not play. "What is it, boy?" Michael asked, his voice quiet in the way he'd learned to speak around the dog, calm and steady even when his own pulse started to quicken. He rose from the chair, his knees protesting slightly. He was only 34, but his body carried the accumulated damage of his service. Shrapnel scars on his left shoulder and thigh. A knee that had been reconstructed after an IED blast threw him 15 feet into a concrete wall. Hearing that would never be quite right again in his left ear. He moved to stand beside Sargent, placing a hand on the dog's head, feeling the tension in the muscles beneath the fur. The window showed him nothing but his own reflection and Sargent's ghostly images superimposed over the darkness beyond. He couldn't see through the rain, couldn't make out the trees that he knew stood 30 yards from the cabin. He reached up and switched off the lamp on the side table, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint glow from the kitchen where he'd left a light on above the stove. His eyes adjusted slowly, the way they'd been trained to do during countless night patrols, and gradually the world outside the window began to take shape. Trees, rain, movement that was just branches swaying in the wind. But Sargent's growl deepened, and the dog took a step closer to the window, his nose nearly touching the glass. Michael felt the hair on the back of his own neck begin to rise, that primitive warning system that evolution had built into human beings, the one that whispered of danger even when the conscious mind couldn't identify the threat. He scanned the darkness again, more carefully this time, using the techniques he'd learned in reconnaissance training. Don't look directly at anything. Let your peripheral vision do the work. Look for movement, for shapes that don't belong, for shadows that are darker than they should be. And then he saw it, or thought he saw it. A light, faint and blue-tinged, flickering between the trees about 50 yards out. It appeared for just a moment, no more than a heartbeat, then vanished. Michael blinked, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks, if maybe he'd been staring into the darkness too long and his brain was filling in details that weren't there. But Sargent lunged forward, his front paws hitting the windowsill, and barked, a sharp, explosive sound that made Michael's heart jump even though he'd been expecting it. "Easy," Michael said, his hand tightening on Sargent's collar. The dog barked again, then again, a rapid-fire series of alerts that meant something had triggered every alarm in his canine brain. Michael pulled his phone from his pocket and activated the flashlight, pressing it against the window to cut through the reflection and the rain. The beam lanced out into the darkness, illuminating diagonal sheets of water and the nearest trees. But the light he thought he'd seen was gone. Nothing moved except the storm itself. He kept the light on for another 30 seconds, sweeping it back and forth across the area where the strange glow had appeared, but there was nothing. Just forest. Just rain. Just the ordinary darkness of a mountain night. Yet Sargent remained tense, his body quivering with the need to investigate, to pursue, to confront whatever had caught his attention. Michael had learned to trust the dog's instincts. During their months together, Sargent had alerted him to a gas leak in the cabin before Michael had smelled anything, had warned him about a deteriorating section of the deck before his foot went through rotten boards, had even woken him one night when a widowmaker branch was about to fall on the roof during a windstorm. The dog's senses were sharper than his own, tuned to frequencies and details that human perception missed. "All right," Michael said, making a decision. "Let's go check it out." He moved to the closet near the front door and pulled out his rain jacket, the heavy-duty kind designed for Pacific Northwest weather, and grabbed Sargent's LED collar from the hook where it hung. The collar was bright red and would make the dog visible even in heavy rain, a safety measure Michael insisted on whenever they went out after dark. He clipped a leash to Sargent's regular collar, though he knew the dog wouldn't stray far from his side. The leash was more for his own peace of mind, a way to keep physical contact with his companion if visibility got too poor. He also reached for something else. The Glock 19 that sat in a quick-access safe mounted on the wall above the closet shelf. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he was being paranoid, if the war had left him too ready to see threats where none existed. But then he remembered the light, that strange blue glow that had no business being in the forest behind his cabin at 10 o'clock on a rainy Thursday night, and he entered the code on the safe's keypad. The lock disengaged with a soft beep, and he removed the pistol, checking the chamber and the magazine with practiced efficiency. 15 rounds, 1 in the pipe. Safety on. He tucked the weapon into the holster he wore whenever he ventured into the deeper woods, the kind of concealed carry rig that sat against his right hip and could be accessed quickly if needed. Sargent watched these preparations with eager anticipation, his tail now wagging slightly despite the tension still evident in his posture. For the dog, this was exciting, an adventure, a chance to fulfill the purpose that had been bred into his ancestors for thousands of years, to investigate and protect and patrol. For Michael, it was something else, a return to a state of heightened awareness that felt both familiar and unwelcome, like slipping into an old uniform that no longer fit quite right but still remembered the shape of your body. He opened the front door, and the sound of the rain immediately doubled in volume, a roar that seemed to fill the world. The porch light created a small island of illumination around the steps, but beyond that was only darkness and water. Michael stepped out, pulling the hood of his jacket over his head, and Sargent bounded forward, pulling at the leash with enthusiasm that Michael had to check with a firm command. "Heel, Sergeant, slow." The dog obeyed immediately, falling into step beside Michael's left leg as they descended the porch steps and began walking around the side of the cabin toward the eastern side where the forest pressed closest. The ground was already saturated, mud sucking at Michael's boots with each step. He kept his left hand on the leash and his right hand free, close to the pistol at his hip, though he felt foolish for it. What was he expecting to find? A bear wouldn't glow blue. Neither would a mountain lion or a wandering hunter who'd gotten lost in the storm. His rational mind insisted that what he'd seen must have been something mundane, a reflection, a trick of light from a passing car on the distant highway, somehow bending through the rain and trees in an unusual way. Ball lightning, maybe, though he'd never heard of ball lightning appearing in a forest. Foxfire, some kind of bioluminescent fungus, though that didn't match what he'd seen either. They rounded the corner of the cabin and Michael aimed his flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the rain to illuminate bark and needles and the tangled undergrowth of sword ferns and salal that covered the forest floor. Sargent pulled forward again, his nose to the ground now, tracking something Michael couldn't smell. They moved deeper into the trees, leaving the faint glow of the cabin lights behind, and Michael felt the familiar weight of isolation settle over him. This was what he'd wanted when he came to the mountains. Distance, separation, a place where the only sounds were natural ones, where he didn't have to navigate the complicated social requirements of a world that had moved on while he'd been overseas, learning lessons no one back home wanted to hear about. But tonight the isolation felt different. Tonight it felt like vulnerability. He was alone out here except for the dog, miles from the nearest neighbor, with no cell signal and a landline that worked only when the wind didn't take down the phone lines. If something happened, if he got hurt or lost or encountered something dangerous, there would be no quick rescue, no calling for backup, no cavalry coming over the hill. There was only him and Sargent and whatever they could handle themselves. The dog stopped abruptly, his body going rigid again, and Michael stopped too, his heart rate picking up as adrenaline began to trickle into his bloodstream. Sargent was staring at a spot between two large cedar trees, maybe 20 yards ahead. His focus absolute. Michael swept his flashlight across the area, seeing nothing unusual at first. Just trees, just ferns, just the constant movement of rain. But then Sargent barked again, that same sharp alert, and lunged forward with enough force that the leash burned across Michael's palm as it slipped through his grip. The dog charged ahead, barking continuously now, and Michael had no choice but to follow, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at his face, his boots slipping on wet roots and moss-covered stones. "Sergeant, stop! Heel!" His commands were lost in the storm and the dogs barking, and then suddenly Sargent did stop, so abruptly that Michael nearly stumbled over him. The dog stood perfectly still, head raised, staring upward, and the barking had changed. It was no longer aggressive or alert, it was something else, something Michael had never heard from the dog before. A sound that was almost mournful, confused, as if Sargent was trying to communicate something but didn't have the vocabulary for it. Michael looked up, following the dog's gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. There, suspended in the air about 15 feet above the ground, was the light. It wasn't a reflection or a trick or anything he could easily explain. It was real, undeniably real, a sphere of pale blue luminescence about the size of a basketball, hovering motionless despite the wind and rain that should have dispersed it if it were fog or mist. The light pulsed gently, brightening and dimming in a slow rhythm that reminded Michael of breathing, and it cast strange shadows through the trees, shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source itself. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his rational mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't natural. It couldn't be natural, but it was there, solid and real and utterly impossible. Sargent had gone silent now, still staring at the light, and Michael could feel the dog trembling against his leg, not with fear exactly, but with something more complex. Uncertainty, confusion, the reaction of an animal confronting something outside its frame of reference, something its instincts couldn't categorize as either threat or non-threat. Michael raised his phone, his hands shaking slightly, and aimed the camera at the light. He needed evidence, needed proof that this was real. that he wasn't hallucinating or suffering from some kind of delayed stress response. The phone's screen showed the light clearly, floating in the darkness, pulsing with that steady rhythm. He pressed the record button and watched as the seconds ticked by. 5 seconds. 10. 15. The light didn't move, didn't change, just continued its gentle breathing pulse in the air above the forest floor. And then it did something that made Michael's blood run cold. It changed color. The blue shifted to green, then to yellow, then to something that was almost purple, cycling through the spectrum in smooth transitions that took perhaps 5 seconds each. With each color change, the shadows around them shifted too, transforming the familiar forest into an alien landscape of moving shapes and uncertain depths. Sargent whimpered, a sound Michael had never heard from the dog, and pressed closer to his leg, seeking reassurance from the one source of stability in this suddenly unstable world. Michael's finger found the safety on his pistol, flicking it off without conscious thought, though he didn't draw the weapon. What good would a gun do against a light? But the gesture gave him comfort anyway. The familiar weight of the weapon on his hip a reminder that he wasn't completely helpless, that he had some means of defending himself, even if he didn't understand what he was defending against. He kept the phone recording, capturing the color changes, the pulsing rhythm, the shadows that danced through the trees like living things. The light began to move. Not quickly, not threateningly, but with a deliberate slowness that suggested purpose rather than random drift. It descended toward the ground, maintaining its size and brightness, and as it drew closer, Michael could see that it wasn't entirely opaque. There was a structure within it, or perhaps a texture, like looking at smoke or cloud formations, patterns that suggested complexity without revealing clear details. The light touched down on the forest floor, settling among the ferns and moss, and for a moment Michael thought it might simply extinguish itself, that whatever strange phenomenon he was witnessing would end as mysteriously as it had begun. But instead, the light spread. It didn't disperse or fade. It spread like liquid, flowing outward from the point of contact, covering the ground in a thin layer of luminescence that highlighted every leaf, every rock, every root and branch within a radius of about 10 feet. The effect was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, like watching the forest floor suddenly develop its own internal light source, and Michael found himself taking an involuntary step backward, pulling Sargent with him. The dog resisted for a moment, still mesmerized by the display, but then followed Michael's lead, matching his retreat step for step. They backed away slowly, Michael keeping the phone aimed at the light, not wanting to turn his back on it, not wanting to lose sight of it, even for a second. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Military experiment? But there were no military bases nearby, and why would they test something like this in civilian territory? Drone technology? But what kind of drone could create light like this? Could pulse and change colors and flow across the ground like a living thing? The light began to retract, pulling back toward its center point, gathering itself into the sphere again. As it did so, Michael noticed something else. The rain wasn't falling on the light, or rather, it was falling. But when the raindrops passed through the sphere, they seemed to hesitate, slow down, bend around it in ways that violated every law of physics he'd learned in high school and community college. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, but once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The rain was behaving as if the light had mass, as if it were a physical object that drops of water needed to navigate around. But the way they moved wasn't quite right, wasn't quite natural. He was so focused on the rain that he almost missed the moment when the light shot upward. One instant it was on the ground, the next it was back in the air, having moved so fast that his eyes couldn't track the motion. It was simply there, hovering again at about 15 feet, having transitioned from one position to another without seeming to pass through the space between. The light pulsed once more, brighter than before, bright enough that Michael had to squint against the glare, and then it began to rise, ascending through the canopy of the trees, passing through branches and needles as if they weren't there. Michael tilted his head back, watching as the light climbed higher and higher, disappearing and reappearing between gaps in the forest cover, growing smaller and fainter until it was just a blue star against the black sky, and then it was gone. extinguished or departed, or simply too far away to see any more. The forest returned to its natural darkness, the only illumination now coming from Michael's flashlight and the faint glow of his phone screen. The rain continued to fall. The wind continued to bend the trees. Everything was as it had been before, as if the last 5 minutes had never happened. Except they had happened. Michael looked down at his phone, stopping the recording, and saw that he had captured 4 minutes and 37 seconds of footage. Proof, evidence. Something that would demonstrate he hadn't imagined this, that his mind wasn't playing tricks on him, that what he'd seen was real and strange and utterly inexplicable. He looked at Sargent, who was still staring up at the canopy, his ears forward, his body tense but no longer trembling. The dog looked back at Michael, and in those brown eyes was a question that Michael couldn't answer. "I don't know, boy," he said quietly. "I don't know what that was." He clipped the leash back onto Sargent's collar, realizing at some point during the encounter he'd dropped it, and began walking back toward the cabin. His legs felt unsteady. His breathing was too fast, and his hands continued to shake long after they'd returned to the warmth and light of the interior. He stripped off his wet jacket, hung it by the door, and dried Sargent with an old towel, the familiar routine helping to ground him in the physical world again. But his mind wouldn't settle. He transferred the video from his phone to his laptop, a battered old MacBook that had survived multiple moves and one accidental drop down a flight of stairs, and watched the footage again. There it was. The light, the colors, the impossible movement, the rain bending around it, all captured in digital clarity, time-stamped and GPS-tagged and undeniably real. He watched it 3 more times, looking for details he might have missed in the moment, and each viewing only deepened his confusion. This wasn't a hoax. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't anything he could explain with conventional knowledge. He opened his browser and started searching. Strange lights in forest. Unexplained luminescence Pacific Northwest. Ball lightning forests Washington. The search results gave him thousands of hits, most of them worthless, scattered reports from people who'd seen odd things in the night, who'd encountered mysteries they couldn't explain. Some were obviously false, claims of alien abductions and government conspiracies, stories that sounded more like creative writing exercises than genuine accounts. Others seemed more credible but still didn't match what he'd experienced. Will-o'-the-wisps, swamp gas, phosphorescent fungi, bioluminescent insects, all of these existed in nature, but none of them behaved like the light he'd seen. He spent 3 hours searching, following link after link, reading scientific papers and eyewitness accounts and amateur videos that showed lights in the sky or strange glows in the wilderness. Nothing matched. Nothing came close. The scientific explanations all fell short, requiring conditions that didn't exist in his forest or behaviors that didn't match what the light had done. The paranormal explanations felt even less satisfying, lacking any grounding in testable reality, asking him to accept premises he couldn't verify. Finally, exhausted and no closer to understanding, he shut the laptop and leaned back in his chair. Sargent had curled up on the rug again, seemingly unbothered by the evening's strangeness, already asleep and probably dreaming of rabbits or the walks they'd take tomorrow. Michael envied the dog's ability to move on, to experience something incomprehensible and then simply accept it without needing to understand or explain. That had never been Michael's way. The Army had trained him to gather intelligence, to analyze situations, to find patterns and make sense of chaos. The habit had become so ingrained that he couldn't shut it off, couldn't simply observe without needing to understand. He looked at the window where this had all started, where Sargent had first detected the light and saw only his reflection staring back. Tired eyes, unkempt beard, hair that needed cutting. The face of a man who'd come to the mountains to escape complications and had somehow found himself in the middle of a mystery that defied everything he thought he knew about the world. He stood, turned off the lights, and made his way to the bedroom, Sargent following close behind. The dog jumped up onto the bed, taking his customary spot at Michael's feet, and within minutes was snoring softly. But Michael lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain, wondering what he was going to do about the video on his laptop. Should he report it to someone? But who? The police would think he was crazy. The Forest Service wouldn't know what to make of it. His sister would worry about his mental health, would probably suggest he needed to get back on his medication, needed to talk to his counselor more frequently. The other veterans in his support group might understand, might believe him, but what could they do? They had their own problems, their own struggles with a world that didn't quite make sense anymore. No, he decided. For now, he'd keep this to himself. He'd watch the video again in the morning, when he was rested and clear-headed, and see if it still looked as impossible as it did now. Maybe daylight would reveal some detail he'd missed, some mundane explanation that his exhausted mind couldn't process at midnight after a strange encounter in the rain. Maybe. But even as he thought this, he knew it wasn't true. He knew what he'd seen. He knew it was real. And he knew, with a certainty that came from years of learning to trust his instincts in dangerous places, that this wasn't over. The light had appeared once. It would appear again. He was right. The next night, Sargent alerted him at almost exactly the same time, 10 o'clock. The dog rising from the rug and moving to the eastern window, ears forward, body tense. Michael was ready this time. He'd spent the day setting up additional cameras around the property, game cameras with night vision and motion sensors, positioning them to cover the area where he'd seen the light. He'd also called an old Army buddy, Marcus, who'd gone on to study electrical engineering after his discharge, and sent him the video, asking for his opinion without revealing exactly what he thought it showed. Marcus had called back within an hour, his voice carrying a note of confusion that mirrored Michael's own feelings. "Brother, I don't know what to tell you. That's the clearest footage of an anomalous aerial phenomenon I've ever seen. The light signature doesn't match anything conventional. Not a flare, not a drone, not any kind of aircraft lighting I'm familiar with. And the way it moves, or doesn't move, the way it seems to ignore wind resistance, I can't explain it. Where'd you say you got this?" "Friend sent it to me," Michael had lied. "Said he captured it on a hiking trip." "Well, your friend should send it to someone who knows more than I do about this stuff. There are organizations that study this kind of thing. MUFON, the Center for UFO Studies, even NASA has a program now for investigating unidentified aerial phenomena. This is the kind of data they want to see." Marcus had paused. "You okay, Mike? You sound stressed." "I'm fine. Just curious about the video." "Okay. Well, if you want to talk, you know I'm here. Don't let yourself get isolated out there." Michael had thanked him and ended the call, feeling guilty about the lie but not ready to admit that he was the source of the footage, that this strangeness was happening in his backyard, that he was once again in a situation where the rules he understood no longer applied. And now, less than 24 hours later, Sargent was alerting again, and Michael grabbed his phone and flashlight and headed for the door, this time bringing his laptop along with a portable battery pack, determined to capture as much information as possible. The light appeared in almost the same location between the two cedar trees, hovering at the same height, pulsing with the same rhythm. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, a sound. Low and deep, felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere that made Michael's teeth ache and set Sargent to whimpering and pressing against his leg. The sound wasn't constant. It pulsed in time with the light, rising and falling. And Michael realized with a start that it wasn't just random vibration. There was a pattern to it, a structure, like listening to a language he couldn't understand, syllables and phrases that carried meaning he couldn't access. He set the laptop on a fallen log, angling the screen to capture the light, and started recording with both the computer's camera and his phone, wanting redundant documentation. The light performed its color cycle again, blue to green to yellow to purple, but this time the transitions were faster, more urgent somehow, and with each color change the sound shifted too, rising in pitch and intensity. Sargent was fully whimpering now, not barking, just making that distressed sound that indicated the dog was overwhelmed, confronting stimuli that his brain couldn't process. Michael knelt beside Sargent, one hand on the dog's back, feeling the tremors running through the animal's body while keeping his eyes on the light. "It's okay, boy. We're okay. Just stay with me." The words were as much for himself as for the dog, a reminder that they were together, that whatever this was, they would face it as a team. The light began to descend again, approaching the ground more quickly this time, and as it did so the sound intensified, becoming almost painful, a pressure in Michael's sinuses and behind his eyes. And then the light did something new. It split. The single sphere divided into 2 smaller spheres, then 4, then 8, multiplying rapidly until there were dozens of smaller lights hovering at various heights, all pulsing in sync, all producing that strange resonant sound. They arranged themselves in a pattern, a geometric configuration that Michael's brain insisted had significance but couldn't interpret. A grid, a constellation, something with purpose and intelligence behind it. That much was clear, but purpose aimed at what? Communication? Observation? Something else entirely? Michael forced himself to remain calm, to observe and document rather than react with the fear that was building in his chest. This was like patrol duty, he told himself. Unknown territory, potential threats. Stay alert, stay focused, gather intelligence. Don't let emotion compromise judgment. But even as he repeated these mantras, he felt the situation spiraling beyond his ability to control or understand. This wasn't like patrol duty. There were no rules of engagement for this, no training that covered encounters with impossible phenomena in the forest behind your cabin. The lights began to move, swirling in an intricate dance, weaving between the trees, creating trails of luminescence that hung in the air for seconds before fading. The pattern reminded Michael of murmuration, the way starlings moved in coordinated flocks, thousands of individual birds somehow acting as a single entity, responding to cues invisible to human observers. But these weren't birds. These were lights with no visible source, moving with impossible precision, creating beauty and terror in equal measure. Sargent suddenly bolted, yanking the leash from Michael's hand, charging not away from the lights but toward them, barking frantically now, that same confused, mournful sound mixing with aggressive alerts. "Sergeant! No! Come back!" Michael lunged after the dog, crashing through the undergrowth, abandoning the laptop and recording equipment in his desperation to retrieve his companion. He couldn't let Sargent get too close to the lights, couldn't let the dog interact with something that might be dangerous, that might harm him in ways Michael couldn't predict or prevent. He caught up with Sargent just as the dog reached the center of the light formation. The smaller spheres had descended to about head height, surrounding them in a cage of luminescence, and Michael felt the vibration intensify, felt it in his bones now, rattling his skeleton, making his vision blur. Sargent had stopped barking and was instead staring at one of the lights, his head tilted in that questioning way dogs have when they encounter something that confuses them. The light he was focusing on was different from the others. It was larger, brighter, and it pulsed at a different rhythm, faster and more insistent. Michael reached out slowly, extending his hand toward the light, not to touch it, but to test its reality, to see if his hand would pass through it like mist, or encounter resistance like a physical object. His fingers drew within inches of the glowing sphere, and he felt heat, not burning but warm like being near a fire, and also something else. A tingling sensation, like mild electrical current dancing across his skin. The hair on his forearm stood up, and he pulled his hand back quickly, his soldier's instincts screaming at him not to make contact, not to interact with something he didn't understand. The lights suddenly shot upward, all of them moving at once, rising through the canopy with that same impossible speed, leaving behind only fading afterimages on Michael's retinas and the echo of that deep, vibrating sound slowly fading from his awareness. He stood there, breathing hard, his heart pounding, Sargent pressed against his leg and trembling. The forest was dark again. The rain continued to fall. Everything was as it had been before, except nothing would ever be quite the same again. Michael had crossed a threshold tonight, had moved from observer to participant, and he knew with absolute certainty that this phenomenon, whatever it was, wasn't finished with him. He retrieved his laptop and phone, checking to make sure the recordings had captured everything, and was relieved to see that they had. Multiple cameras, multiple angles, clear footage of the lights splitting and moving and surrounding them. This was no longer just strange. This was world-changing, or at least it should be. This was evidence of something beyond current scientific understanding, something that demanded investigation and study and answers. Back in the cabin, Michael began a more systematic approach. He created a document on his laptop, logging every detail he could remember from both encounters. time of appearance, duration, behavior patterns, environmental conditions, sounds, physical effects. He sketched diagrams of the light formations, measured distances from landmarks using satellite imagery of his property, noted Sargent's reactions and his own physiological responses. This was field reporting, the kind of detailed documentation he'd done countless times during his service, and the familiar process helped settle his nerves, gave him a sense of control over a situation that felt increasingly uncontrollable. Over the next week, the lights appeared 5 more times, always at night, always when Sargent first detected them, but with increasing complexity and duration. They came at different times now, not just 10 o'clock but also midnight, 3 a.m., even once at sunset when there was still enough ambient light that Michael could see them clearly without night vision. The patterns became more elaborate, the sounds more varied, and Michael documented everything, filling drives with video footage, notebooks with sketches and observations, building a database of information that he knew was scientifically invaluable even if he didn't understand what it meant. On the 8th night, something different happened. The lights appeared as usual, Sargent alerted. Michael went outside with his equipment, but this time when the lights descended and split into their multiple sphere formation, they didn't just hover and dance. They began to project images. Or at least that's what Michael's brain interpreted them as. Shadows appeared on the ground, on the trees, moving shapes that suggested forms without clearly defining them. He saw what might have been buildings, or perhaps mountains. He saw what looked like water, rippling and reflecting light. He saw suggestions of movement, figures that could have been people or animals or something else entirely. It was like watching a story told in silhouette, in pantomime, a narrative composed of light and shadow that his conscious mind couldn't quite grasp, but that resonated with something deeper, something instinctive. Sargent sat beside him, no longer barking or whimpering, just watching with that same intense focus, and Michael wondered if the dog was seeing the same things he was, if these images were objective reality being projected into the forest, or subjective hallucinations triggered by the light's effect on their nervous systems. The display lasted for nearly 20 minutes, far longer than any previous encounter, and when it ended the lights didn't shoot upward and disappear. Instead, they condensed back into a single sphere, brighter and larger than before, pulsing with that breathing rhythm, and then they moved toward the cabin. Not quickly, not threateningly, but with clear purpose. Michael stood his ground, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run, to take cover, to get Sargent inside and bar the door. But he needed to see this through, needed to understand what was happening, needed answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate. The light stopped about 10 feet from where he stood, hovering at eye level, and Michael found himself staring into it, trying to penetrate its surface, trying to see what lay beneath the glow. Up close, the light was even more complex than he'd realized. It wasn't uniform. There were layers within it, structures that shifted and rotated, patterns that reminded him of the way clouds moved in time-lapse photography or the way oil swirled on water. And within those patterns, he thought he could see something else. Shapes, geometries, mathematical precision that suggested design rather than accident. The sound changed again, becoming less of a vibration and more of a tone, a single, sustained note that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate directly in his mind. With the tone came something unexpected, a feeling, not emotion exactly, but sensation, like memory without images, like knowing something without having learned it. The feeling was curiosity. That was the closest word Michael could find for it. The light was curious about him, about Sargent, about this place. It was observing them with the same intensity that they were observing it, and somehow Michael could sense this, could feel the attention focused on him like weight or pressure or the gaze of eyes he couldn't see. Sargent whined softly and took a step forward, moving closer to the light despite Michael's instinctive grab for his collar. The dog approached with caution but without fear, his tail held neutral, his ears forward, every line of his body expressing interest rather than aggression. Michael let the leash play out, watching as Sargent closed the distance to within a foot of the glowing sphere, close enough that the light cast strange shadows through the dog's fur, highlighting individual hairs and the texture of his coat. The dog sniffed at the light, his nose twitching, trying to gather information through scent the way dogs do when confronting anything new. Michael held his breath, terrified that something would happen, that Sargent would be hurt or changed or taken, but the light simply pulsed brighter for a moment as if responding to the dog's investigation, and then dimmed again. Sargent sat down, looking back at Michael with an expression that clearly communicated something, though Michael couldn't interpret what. The dog wasn't alarmed. That much was clear. Whatever the light was, Sargent had decided it wasn't a threat. Michael took a step closer himself, his hand still hovering near the pistol at his hip, though he knew the weapon was useless against this phenomenon. Another step, another, until he was standing beside Sargent, close enough to the light that he could feel its warmth on his face, could see his own shadow cast on the trees behind him, elongated and distorted. He raised his hand again, more deliberately this time, extending it toward the sphere, and this time he didn't pull back. His fingers made contact with the surface of the light. It felt like nothing he could have anticipated. Not solid, but not insubstantial either. It was like touching water that held its shape, or air that had somehow acquired texture. There was the tingling he'd felt before, stronger now, almost uncomfortable, and a warmth that intensified where his skin met the light's surface. But there was something else too. Information. That was the only word he could find for it. The moment he touched the light, his mind filled with impressions, fragments of understanding that came too fast to process individually but left residue behind. Like remembering a dream after waking, he saw distance, vast distance, the kind of space that existed between stars, between galaxies, measured in units that made light years seem like inches. He felt time differently, not as the linear progression he was used to, but as something more fluid, more navigable, more like terrain that could be traversed in multiple directions. He sensed purpose, intention, a journey undertaken for reasons he couldn't fully grasp, but that involved observation, documentation, understanding. And underneath it all, threaded through everything else, was that same curiosity he'd sensed before, amplified now, focused with laser intensity on him and Sargent in this small clearing in a Pacific Northwest forest. Michael jerked his hand back, gasping, his mind reeling from the influx of sensation and information. It was too much, too alien, too far outside the framework of his understanding to integrate into anything coherent. He staggered backward, and Sargent was immediately there, pressing against him, offering stability and comfort in the way the dog had learned to do during Michael's difficult moments when the past threatened to overwhelm the present. Michael steadied himself, one hand on Sargent's head, his breathing gradually slowing as he regained his equilibrium. The light pulsed once more, brightly enough that Michael had to shield his eyes, and then it began to rise, ascending slowly this time, deliberately, as if giving them time to watch its departure. It climbed through the canopy, navigating between branches with impossible precision, and kept climbing until it was just a star among stars, indistinguishable from the natural lights of the night sky. Then it was gone, and Michael was left standing in the darkness with his dog and his racing thoughts and the absolute certainty that nothing in his life would ever be the same. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his laptop, trying to articulate what he'd experienced when he touched the light, but words failed him. How do you describe sensation that bypasses language? How do you communicate understanding that exists below the level of conscious thought? He wrote and deleted, filling and emptying pages as he struggled to capture something fundamentally uncapturable. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he gave up and simply wrote, "Contact made, information exchanged, origin unclear, purpose unclear, intelligence confirmed." Intelligence. That was the key word, the one that changed everything. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It wasn't ball lightning or swamp gas or any kind of atmospheric anomaly. It was intelligent. It was aware. It was studying them with the same intensity they'd been studying it, and the implications of that realization were staggering. If this intelligence was extraterrestrial, and Michael's experience suggested it was, then humanity wasn't alone in the universe. The question that philosophers and scientists had debated for centuries had been answered. Here, in his forest, documented on his cameras and experienced through his own touch. But who would believe him? Who could he tell without sounding like every conspiracy theorist and UFO enthusiast who'd ever claimed contact with otherworldly intelligence? The video footage was impressive, certainly, but video could be faked. His testimony would be dismissed as the delusions of a traumatized veteran struggling with PTSD. Even the physical evidence he might gather, burn marks on trees or disturbed soil or electromagnetic anomalies, could be explained away by skeptics determined not to believe. He needed more than his own documentation. He needed corroboration. He needed other witnesses, scientific equipment, institutional support. He needed someone with credibility and resources to take this seriously, to investigate properly, to help him understand what was happening and why. And as he sat there watching the sunrise through his cabin window, Sargent snoring softly at his feet, an idea began to form. NASA. Marcus had mentioned that NASA had a program for investigating unidentified aerial phenomena. They'd been collecting reports, analyzing data, trying to bring scientific rigor to a field that had been dominated by pseudoscience and sensationalism for too long. If anyone might take him seriously, if anyone might have the expertise and resources to make sense of this, it would be them. He pulled up NASA's website and began searching for contact information, for the right department or division or individual who might listen to a former Army specialist living alone in the mountains with an impossible story and undeniable evidence. It took most of the morning, following links and reading mission statements and program descriptions, but eventually he found what he was looking for: the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Research Office, a division created specifically to investigate unexplained aerial observations with potential national security or scientific significance. They had a submission portal, a way for members of the public to report sightings and provide documentation. Michael stared at the form on his screen, his cursor hovering over the fields he would need to fill out, wondering if this was wise, if involving the government wouldn't just complicate an already complicated situation. But what choice did he have? He couldn't ignore this, couldn't pretend it wasn't happening, and he certainly couldn't investigate it alone, not with the resources available to him. If there was intelligent life visiting Earth, studying humanity, interacting with individuals like himself, then this was bigger than his desire for privacy and solitude. This was something the world needed to know about, something that transcended his personal comfort or convenience. He began filling out the form: name, location, date and time of first sighting, description of the phenomenon, supporting documentation. He uploaded selected video files, choosing the clearest footage from multiple encounters, including the close-up recording from the night he'd touched the light. He wrote a detailed narrative of his experiences, trying to sound credible and rational while describing events that were inherently incredible. He included his military background, his training in observation and reconnaissance, his lack of history with mental illness or substance abuse, anything that might lend weight to his testimony. When he finished, his hand hovered over the submit button. This was the moment of no return. Once he sent this, he would be in their system, his name attached to claims about alien intelligence and impossible lights in the forest. There would be questions, maybe visits, certainly scrutiny of his background and his credibility. His quiet life in the mountains would become much less quiet. Was he ready for that? Was he willing to sacrifice his privacy for the sake of understanding and potentially helping humanity make sense of something world-changing? Sargent nudged his leg, looking up at him with those brown eyes that seemed to understand more than they should, and Michael made his decision. He clicked Submit. The form disappeared, replaced by a confirmation message thanking him for his report and informing him that his submission would be reviewed by qualified personnel, and he might be contacted for follow-up questions. The whole transaction felt anticlimactic somehow, like he'd expected more ceremony or acknowledgement for taking such a significant step. But government bureaucracy didn't work that way. His report was now just another data point in a system processing thousands of similar claims, most of which were probably worthless. The lights appeared again that night, and the night after, and the night after that. Michael documented each encounter with increasingly sophisticated equipment, Having ordered thermal cameras and electromagnetic field detectors and audio recording devices capable of capturing sounds outside the human hearing range. The lights seemed to respond to his increased scrutiny by becoming more complex, more varied in their behavior, almost as if they were deliberately providing him with better data, helping him build a more complete picture of their capabilities. On the fourth night after submitting his report to NASA, Michael was awakened at 2 a.m. not by sergeant's barking but by his phone ringing. He fumbled for the device on his nightstand, his mind foggy with interrupted sleep, and saw an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. He almost didn't answer, assuming it was a spam call or wrong number, but something made him slide his thumb across the screen and raise the phone to his ear. "Hello, Mr. Reed, Michael Reed." The voice was male, professional, with the crisp enunciation of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Dr. David Chen. I'm calling from NASA's Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Research Office. You submitted a report to us 4 days ago regarding unusual aerial phenomena observed on your property in Washington State. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Michael sat up fully, suddenly wide awake, Sergeant raising his head from the foot of the bed to watch him. Yes, of course." "Excellent. Mr. Reed, I've reviewed your submission along with several colleagues, and I have to say, your documentation is remarkably thorough. The video footage in particular is some of the highest quality evidence we've received. I'd like to ask you some questions, if that's all right, to clarify certain details and assess the ongoing nature of these events." For the next 40 minutes, Michael answered questions. What exactly did the lights do? Had he experienced any physical effects during or after encounters? Had any other individuals witnessed the phenomena? Did the events seem to follow any pattern or schedule? Had he noticed any unusual activity in the area prior to the first sighting? Dr. Chen was methodical. Taking notes Michael could hear being typed in the background, asking follow-up questions that indicated he was actually listening and thinking critically about the responses. "Mr. Reed?" "Doctor," Chen said finally, "based on what you've told me and the evidence you provided, I believe your property is experiencing genuine anomalous phenomena that warrant serious investigation. With your permission, I'd like to send a team to your location to conduct on-site analysis and install more sophisticated monitoring equipment. This would involve a small group of researchers, probably 3 to 4 people, staying in the area for approximately 2 weeks. Would you be willing to cooperate with such an investigation?" Michael's heart raced. This was real. They believed him. They were taking him seriously. "Yes," he said. "Absolutely. When would you want to come?" "As soon as possible. The phenomena appear to be ongoing and active, which means we have a window of opportunity that might not remain open indefinitely. I can have a team there within 72 hours if you're agreeable. They'll need access to your property, particularly the area where you've been observing the lights, and they'll need to interview you extensively. They'll be respectful of your privacy and your time, but I won't lie to you. This will be disruptive to your normal routine." "I understand. My normal routine can wait. This is more important. I'm glad you see it that way. Mr. Reed, I want to emphasize that what you've documented here could be scientifically significant. We need to approach this methodically and carefully, which means we'll be asking you to maintain confidentiality about the investigation. Don't discuss this with neighbors. Don't post about it online. Don't contact media. We need to control the information flow until we understand what we're dealing with. Can you agree to that?" "Yes, I haven't told anyone except you." "Good. You'll receive an email within the next few hours with details about the team's arrival, what equipment they'll be bringing, and what to expect during the investigation. In the meantime, please continue documenting any encounters you have with the phenomena. The more data we can gather before the team arrives, the better prepared they'll be." After the call ended, Michael sat in the darkness, his mind racing. A NASA team, coming here, to his cabin, to investigate something happening in his backyard. It felt surreal, like he'd stepped into a science fiction novel or one of those conspiracy theory documentaries he'd always dismissed as paranoid fantasy. But it was real. It was happening. And in 72 hours, his isolated life was about to become very crowded. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and continued encounters. The lights appeared each night, and Michael dutifully recorded everything, building a database of footage that grew more comprehensive with each observation. He also did practical things, cleaning the cabin more thoroughly than he had in months, making sure there was enough food and coffee for visitors, clearing space in his small spare room for equipment storage. Sargent watched these preparations with canine curiosity, seeming to sense that change was coming, that their routine was about to be disrupted in significant ways. The team arrived on schedule, driving up his long dirt driveway in 2 SUVs loaded with equipment cases and duffel bags. Dr. Chen had not come himself, but he'd sent 3 researchers who introduced themselves with professional courtesy and obvious excitement. Dr. Sarah Martinez was an astrophysicist specializing in plasma dynamics and atmospheric phenomena. Dr. James Okafor was an electrical engineer with expertise in electromagnetic fields and sensor technology. And Dr. Emily Strand was a psychologist who studied perception and cognition, particularly in high-stress situations. They were younger than Michael had expected, probably in their 30s, and they treated him with respect that surprised him, listening to his descriptions without skepticism or condescension. They set up quickly and efficiently, installing sensors around the perimeter of the area where Michael had observed the lights, mounting cameras with better resolution and range than anything he owned, running cables and calibrating equipment with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. By nightfall, they had created a sophisticated monitoring station in Michael's living room, multiple screens displaying different camera angles and data readouts, computers running analysis software that looked for patterns Michael couldn't begin to understand. "Now we wait," Dr. Martinez said, settling into a chair with a cup of coffee, her eyes on the screens. "Mr. Reed, you said the phenomena have been appearing nightly. Do you have any sense of when they might show up tonight?" "Sargent usually alerts before I see anything," Michael said, gesturing to the dog who was watching the strangers with reserved interest. "He detects them somehow, maybe by sound or smell or something else. When he starts acting restless and focusing on the east windows, it's usually within minutes of the lights appearing." "Fascinating," Dr. Okafor said. "Animals often perceive things outside human sensory range. We should monitor him as carefully as we monitor the environment." They didn't have to wait long. At 9:47, Sargent rose from his position beside Michael's chair and moved to the window, his body tensing, his ears forward. "Here we go," Michael said quietly, and immediately the team sprang into action, checking their equipment, adjusting cameras, pulling on jackets to go outside. Michael grabbed his own jacket and Sargent's leash, and together the group moved onto the porch and then into the yard, the scientists carrying handheld instruments that beeped and displayed readings Michael couldn't interpret. The lights appeared exactly where they had before, between the cedar trees, and Michael heard Dr. Martinez gasp. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's real. It's actually real." The sphere hovered in the darkness, pulsing with that familiar rhythm, and the scientists' instruments went wild. Alarms sounding, displays flashing with data that seemed to overwhelm the device's capacity to process. "I'm reading massive electromagnetic fluctuations," Dr. Okafor said, his voice tight with excitement. "The field strength is orders of magnitude beyond anything natural, and the frequency distribution is impossible. It's like the signal is occupying multiple frequencies simultaneously, overlapping in ways that should cancel out but don't. Temperature anomaly," Dr. Strand added, watching her thermal camera. "The area around the light is actually cooler than the surrounding air, not warmer. That violates basic thermodynamics unless there's active heat extraction happening." The light began its color cycle, and Dr. Martinez was frantically taking notes, speaking into a recorder clipped to her collar, documenting everything she observed. The sphere split into multiple smaller lights, performing the geometric dance Michael had seen before, and the scientists spread out, triangulating measurements, capturing the phenomenon from multiple angles with multiple instruments. Sargent remained close to Michael, calmer than he'd been during early encounters, as if he'd grown accustomed to the lights or perhaps just found reassurance in the presence of the group. The display lasted nearly 30 minutes. longer than any previous encounter, and Michael wondered if the lights were responding to the increased attention, if they recognized that this observation was more sophisticated than his solo documentation had been. When the lights finally condensed back into a single sphere and began to ascend, Dr. Martinez actually looked disappointed. "Don't go," she murmured, though of course the light didn't respond to her plea. It rose through the canopy and disappeared, leaving the scientists standing in the darkness with their instruments still beeping with residual readings. Back in the cabin, the team immediately began analyzing the data they'd collected, downloading files from cameras and sensors, running preliminary calculations, comparing readings against known phenomena. Michael watched them work, seeing the excitement in their faces, the intensity of their focus, and realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. These were serious scientists, credentialed experts, and they were completely baffled. Whatever the lights were, they exceeded current understanding not just slightly, but dramatically. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Okafor said finally, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes. "The energy requirements alone for what we just observed are staggering. That light source, if it's producing illumination through conventional means, would require a power source weighing several tons and generating heat that would be visible from miles away. But there's no heat signature. No emissions we can detect except the light itself and the electromagnetic field. It's like the energy is coming from nowhere, or from somewhere we can't measure. Could it be some kind of advanced drone technology?" Dr. Strand asked. "Military prototype, maybe?" Dr. Martinez shook her head. "No drone could perform those maneuvers. The acceleration we documented when it split into multiple spheres was in excess of 200 Gs. No physical craft could withstand that. No pilot, no electronics, no structural material we possess. And there was no sound except that low-frequency vibration, no propulsion signature, no exhaust or thrust vectors. Whatever this is, it's not operating on principles of physics as we currently understand them." "So, what are we saying?" Michael asked quietly. "That this is extraterrestrial?" The three scientists looked at each other, and Michael could see them weighing their words carefully, aware of the implications of what they were about to articulate. Dr. Martinez spoke first. "Mr. Reed, in science we generally avoid jumping to exotic explanations when mundane ones might suffice. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But I'll be honest with you. The evidence we've collected tonight, combined with your footage from previous encounters, is extraordinary. This isn't ball lightning. It isn't a natural plasma phenomenon. It isn't military technology or atmospheric anomaly. This is controlled, intelligent, and utilizing technology or capabilities that are decades or centuries beyond our current understanding. Is it extraterrestrial? I don't know, but it's not terrestrial in any conventional sense." Over the next week, the team documented 4 more encounters with the lights, each time gathering more data, refining their measurements, building a more complete picture of the phenomenon's characteristics and behavior. They discovered that the lights produced gravitational anomalies, subtle but measurable distortions in local spacetime that suggested mass far beyond what their apparent size would indicate. They found that the electromagnetic signature included frequencies that shouldn't exist according to Maxwell's equations, suggesting the lights were somehow generating fields that violated fundamental laws of physics. They documented that the lights seemed to respond to observation, becoming more active and complex when multiple people were present, almost as if they were deliberately providing more information for study. On the 8th night of the investigation, something changed. The lights appeared as usual, but this time they didn't just perform their aerial display. They came closer, descending until they were hovering just above ground level, surrounding the group of observers in a circle of luminescence. The scientists were clearly nervous, stepping closer together, hands on their instruments but eyes wide with wonder and fear. Sargent pressed against Michael's leg, whimpering softly, and Michael placed a reassuring hand on the dog's head. One of the lights, larger and brighter than the others, moved directly toward Dr. Martinez. She stood frozen, and Michael could see her trembling even from several feet away. The light stopped inches from her face, pulsing gently, and she raised one shaking hand toward it, just as Michael had done during his own contact experience. Her fingers touched the surface of the light and her entire body went rigid. Her eyes widened, Her breath caught, and for 5 seconds that felt like an eternity she remained perfectly still, locked in whatever exchange was happening between her consciousness and the phenomenon. Then the light pulled back, and Dr. Martinez collapsed. Dr. Okafor caught her before she hit the ground, easing her down while Dr. Strand checked her pulse and breathing. "She's okay," Dr. Strand said. "Pulse is elevated but steady. Breathing is normal. I think she fainted." The lights maintained their circle for another moment, then simultaneously shot upward, disappearing with that characteristic impossible acceleration, leaving the group in darkness illuminated only by their flashlights and the ambient glow from the cabin. They carried Dr. Martinez inside and laid her on the couch. She regained consciousness within minutes, her eyes fluttering open, confusion giving way to clarity. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Did you see what I saw?" "What did you see?" Michael asked gently, kneeling beside the couch. "Everything," she whispered. I can't describe it. Distance, time, dimensions I don't have names for, and information. So much information. Too much. Like trying to drink from a fire hose. My brain couldn't process it all, couldn't hold it, but fragments are still there. Equations, principles, a different way of understanding reality." She looked at Michael with new recognition in her eyes. "You touched it too, didn't you? You experienced this?" Michael nodded. "Yes, a few nights before I contacted NASA. It's overwhelming. That's an understatement." Dr. Martinez sat up slowly, waving off Dr. Strand's attempts to keep her lying down. "We need to document what I experienced while it's still fresh. I need to write down everything I can remember before it fades." She grabbed a notebook and began scribbling frantically, filling pages with mathematical notation and sketches and verbal descriptions that tumbled out in a stream of consciousness. The team worked through the night, Dr. Martinez dictating while the others recorded and transcribed, trying to capture as much as possible of what she'd perceived during contact with the light. By dawn, they had dozens of pages of notes, most of which made little sense even to Dr. Martinez herself, fragments of understanding that resisted coherent articulation. But buried in the confusion were hints of something profound. References to space-time manipulation, descriptions of propulsion systems that worked by altering the geometry of space rather than pushing against it. Suggestions that consciousness itself might be a fundamental force of the universe, as real and measurable as gravity or electromagnetism. "This is going to sound crazy," Dr. Martinez said as the sun rose, painting the sky pink and gold beyond the cabin windows. "But I think that phenomenon, those lights, they're not from another planet. They're from another understanding of what planets and space and existence mean. They're not traveling through space to get here. They're manipulating the relationship between themselves and here, making distance meaningless. Does that make any sense?" "No," Dr. Okafor admitted. "But most revolutionary scientific concepts don't make sense until suddenly they do. Newton's gravity was crazy until it explained everything about planetary motion. Quantum mechanics was nonsense until it predicted atomic behavior with perfect accuracy. Maybe what you experienced is the next revolution, the next fundamental shift in how we understand reality." They stayed for another week, documenting 3 more encounters, but none of the other team members achieved the same depth of contact that Dr. Martinez had experienced. The lights seemed to have delivered their message, or at least the portion of it they intended for this particular group at this particular time, and subsequent appearances were shorter, less interactive, almost perfunctory. Finally, Dr. Chen called from Washington and instructed the team to return, saying they had gathered enough preliminary data and needed to begin serious analysis at facilities better equipped than a cabin in the mountains. "What happens now?" Michael asked as they packed their equipment on the final day. "Now we write reports," Dr. Martinez said. "We analyze the data. We try to make sense of what we've documented, and we determine next steps. This won't be quick, Mr. Reed. What we've witnessed here needs to be verified, peer-reviewed, examined from every possible angle before we can make any public statements. It could take months or even years. And in the meantime, you continue documenting if the phenomena continue. You maintain confidentiality, and you wait. I know that's not satisfying, but it's how science works. Slow and careful, especially when the implications are this significant." After they left, the cabin felt empty despite Sargent's presence. Michael had grown accustomed to the company over the past 2 weeks, to having people to discuss his experiences with, to feeling less isolated in his encounter with the impossible. Now he was alone again, just him and the dog and the mountains and the lights that continued to appear with decreasing frequency, as if their purpose had been served and they were gradually withdrawing. 3 months passed. Michael received occasional emails from Dr. Chen, brief updates that revealed little. The data was being analyzed. The team was writing papers. There were discussions happening at levels above Dr. Chen's pay grade about how and when to disclose their findings. Michael should be patient. He should continue documenting. He should not discuss the investigation with anyone. The lights appeared only twice during those 3 months, brief visits that seemed almost like farewells, final confirmations that what had happened was real before moving on to whatever came next in their incomprehensible agenda. Sargent barely reacted to these final encounters, as if he too understood that the phenomenon had run its course, that the period of intense activity was over. Michael recorded the appearances dutifully but with a sense of anticlimax. After the intensity of the investigation, after the revelations and contact and scientific scrutiny, these simple observations felt insufficient, incomplete. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late October, Michael received an email that changed everything. It was from Dr. Chen, marked urgent, with a subject line that read, "Media release, your input requested." Michael opened it with trembling hands and read the message 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. NASA was going public. They were holding a press conference in 2 weeks to announce significant findings regarding unidentified anomalous phenomena, including details about what they were calling the most compelling evidence to date of technology utilizing principles beyond current human understanding. The press conference would feature video footage from multiple sources, including Michael's documentation and the team's investigation. NASA was inviting Michael to attend, though his participation would be optional and his identity could be protected if he preferred. But there was more. The email included an attachment, a pre-publication draft of a paper titled Documented Observation and Analysis of Anomalous Aerial Phenomena Demonstrating Non-Conventional Propulsion and Apparent Space-Time Manipulation. Michael downloaded it and began reading, his heart pounding. The paper was dense with technical language and mathematical analysis, but the conclusions were clear. The phenomena observed at Michael's property demonstrated characteristics consistent with controlled manipulation of fundamental physical forces. The energy signatures, the movement patterns, the gravitational anomalies, all pointed to technology operating on principles that current human science could not explain or replicate. The paper had multiple authors, including all 3 members of the team that had visited his cabin, and it was being submitted to Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. If accepted and published, it would be the first peer-reviewed scientific paper to present strong evidence for technology of likely non-human origin operating on Earth. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a tabloid story or a conspiracy theory. This was serious science reaching a conclusion that would force humanity to reconsider its place in the universe. Michael closed his laptop and looked at Sargent, who was watching him with those knowing brown eyes. "They believe us, boy," he said quietly. "They actually believe us, and they're telling the world." The dog's tail wagged once, twice as if understanding, and Michael felt something shift inside himself. For months, he'd carried the weight of this knowledge alone, even after the investigation, even after having his experiences validated by credentialed scientists. There had always been doubt, always been the possibility that he was wrong, that there was some mundane explanation he'd missed, that his damaged mind was playing tricks on him. But now that doubt was gone. NASA was staking its reputation on the reality of what he'd documented. They were telling the world that something impossible was happening, that the universe was stranger and more wonderful than humanity had allowed itself to believe. And in doing so, they were validating not just his observations, but his sanity, his credibility, his worth as a witness to something profound. The press conference was scheduled for November 15th, held at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and broadcast live across multiple platforms. Michael decided to attend in person, and they flew him out 3 days early, putting him up in a hotel near the facility, briefing him on what to expect, how to handle media attention, what he could and couldn't discuss. Dr. Chen met with him privately the day before the conference, his expression serious. "Mr. Reed, tomorrow is going to change your life, probably in ways you can't anticipate. Once your name is associated with this discovery, you'll lose your anonymity. People will want to talk to you, interview you, hear your story. Some will believe you and want to celebrate you. Others will doubt and attack your credibility. You need to be prepared for both reactions." "I understand," Michael said, though he wasn't sure he truly did. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued. "The phenomena at your property. The lights. They haven't appeared in over 6 weeks according to your reports. We believe they may have completed whatever their purpose was, at least for now. But there's also a possibility that tomorrow's announcement might trigger renewed activity. If these phenomena are monitoring us, observing human society, then a major public disclosure about their existence might prompt a response. If activity resumes at your location or anywhere else, we need you to contact us immediately." The press conference began at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Michael sat in the front row of the auditorium, flanked by Dr. Martinez and the other members of the investigation team, facing a room full of journalists and cameras and the bright lights of live broadcast. The NASA administrator opened with prepared remarks about the agency's commitment to scientific rigor and transparent investigation of unexplained phenomena. Then Dr. Chen took the podium and began presenting the findings. He showed video footage, Michael's original recordings alongside the enhanced and analyzed versions created during the investigation. He showed data readouts, graphs of electromagnetic signatures and gravitational measurements, thermal imaging that revealed the impossible cooling effect around the lights. He explained the team's methodology, their attempts to rule out conventional explanations, the peer review process their conclusions had undergone, and then he showed Dr. Martinez's contact experience, the moment when she touched the light and her body went rigid, along with subsequent brain scans that revealed unusual activity patterns that had persisted for weeks afterward. "What we are presenting today," Dr. Chen said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was articulating, "is not proof of extraterrestrial visitation. That conclusion would require evidence we don't yet possess. What we have documented is technology, or perhaps something we don't yet have language to properly describe, that operates using principles our current scientific understanding cannot explain. This technology demonstrates controlled, intelligent behavior. It appears to observe and respond to human activity, and most significantly, it seems to be capable of directly interfacing with human consciousness in ways that suggest information transfer or communication." He paused, letting that sink in, and Michael could see the journalists in the audience exchanging glances, some skeptical, others excited, all of them recognizing they were witnessing a historic moment. "Our assessment," Dr. Chen continued, "is that this represents the most credible documented evidence to date of phenomena that exceed human technological capabilities and may represent contact with non-human intelligence. Further investigation is not just warranted but essential, and NASA is committed to pursuing this research with the full resources and scientific rigor it deserves." The question period that followed was chaotic. Dozens of journalists trying to speak at once, asking everything from practical questions about methodology to wild speculation about alien invasion. Dr. Chen handled it with professional calm, neither overreaching in his claims nor backing away from the fundamental conclusions. Yes, this could be extraterrestrial technology. No, there was no evidence of threat or hostile intent. Yes, the investigation was ongoing. No, they didn't have all the answers. Science rarely did, especially at the frontier of discovery. Finally, a journalist near the back raised her hand and asked the question Michael had been dreading. "Dr. Chen, who is the primary witness in this case? Who first documented these phenomena?" Dr. Chen looked at Michael, a silent question in his eyes, and Michael nodded. He'd agreed to this. He'd known it was coming. The initial observations were made by Michael Reed, a resident of rural Washington state and a former U.S. Army specialist. Mr. Reed is here today and has agreed to speak with you." Michael stood, his legs unsteady, and moved to the podium as Dr. Chen stepped aside. He looked out at the sea of faces and cameras, more people than he'd been in front of since his discharge ceremony years ago, and felt his throat tighten. But then he felt a hand on his shoulder, Dr. Martinez offering silent support, and he found his voice. "My name is Michael Reed," he began, gripping the edges of the podium to steady himself. "I'm a veteran. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I came home with PTSD, with injuries, with memories that made it hard to sleep at night. I moved to the mountains to find peace, to find quiet, to get away from a world that felt too loud and too complicated. And then one night, my dog started barking at something I couldn't see." He told the story, not all of it, but enough. The first sighting, Sergeant's reactions, the decision to document rather than dismiss, the growing complexity of the encounters, the moment of contact when he touched the light and felt information flood into his mind. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, the way he'd learned to give briefings during his military service. Just facts, just observations, just the truth as he'd experienced it. "I know how this sounds," he said, approaching the end of his statement. "I know there will be people who doubt me, who think I'm crazy or lying or mistaken. For a long time, I doubted myself. But then NASA sent scientists, real scientists with equipment and expertise, and they saw what I saw. They measured what I measured. One of them even touched the light like I did, and she experienced the same overwhelming sense of information, of intelligence, of something trying to communicate across a gap we don't have bridges for yet." He paused, meeting the eyes of individual journalists scattered through the audience. "I don't know what those lights were. I don't know where they came from, or why they chose my forest, my property, me. But I know they were real. I know they were intelligent. And I know that pretending they didn't exist, that this didn't happen, would be a disservice to everyone who's ever looked up at the stars and wondered if we're alone. We're not alone. Whatever that means, whatever implications it carries, we're not alone. And that's terrifying and wonderful in equal measure." The questions came at him rapidly after that, faster than he could answer. What did the information feel like? Had the lights returned since the investigation ended? Did he think they were still watching him? Was he afraid? Did this change his religious beliefs, his worldview, his plans for the future? He answered what he could, admitted ignorance when he didn't know, and tried to convey the complex mix of emotions that had defined his experience. Fear, yes, but also wonder. Confusion, certainly, but also a strange sense of privilege, of having been chosen somehow to witness something precious and rare. The press conference ended after nearly 3 hours, but the media attention didn't stop. Michael gave interviews to major news outlets, appeared on morning shows and podcasts, watched as his face and story spread across social media and news websites around the world. The reactions were exactly as Dr. Chen had predicted. Some people celebrated him as a hero, a witness to humanity's first genuine contact with alien intelligence. Others attacked him viciously, calling him a fraud, an attention seeker, a mentally ill veteran being exploited by NASA to justify their budget. The scientific community was more measured, but no less divided. Some researchers hailed the NASA paper as groundbreaking, the beginning of a new era in physics and our understanding of the universe. Others criticized the methodology, questioned the conclusions, demanded more evidence before accepting such extraordinary claims. The paper was published in Nature after rigorous peer review, but with editorial commentary noting the controversial nature of the findings and the need for replication and further study. Michael returned to his cabin 3 weeks after the press conference, exhausted by the attention, grateful to be home. Sergeant greeted him with ecstatic enthusiasm, and Michael spent the first day just walking his property, reacquainting himself with the silence and solitude he'd sought when he first moved here. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't the silence of isolation, but the silence of anticipation, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The lights didn't return immediately. Days passed, then weeks, and Michael began to wonder if they were truly gone, if their purpose had been served and they'd moved on to other observations, other contacts, other witnesses. He maintained his documentation routine out of habit more than expectation, checking his cameras each morning, reviewing footage that showed only ordinary forest nights, deer and raccoons and the occasional bear, but no mysterious luminescence. Then, on the night of December 23rd, as the first major snowstorm of the season blanketed the mountains in white silence, Sargent alerted. Michael was reading by the fire, a mug of tea cooling on the side table, when the dog stood and moved to the window, his posture unmistakable. Michael's heart leaped. He grabbed his phone and camera and went to the door, pulling on boots and jacket, stepping out onto the porch where snow was already accumulating in soft drifts. The lights appeared, but they were different this time. There were more of them, dozens instead of the handful he'd grown accustomed to, and they arranged themselves not in random patterns, but in something that looked deliberately structured, almost like language written in luminescence across the dark sky. They hovered above the tree line, pulsing in complex sequences, and Michael realized with a start that this wasn't like previous encounters. This was intentional. This was a message. He recorded everything, his hands shaking not from cold but from the magnitude of what he was witnessing. The lights maintained their formation for nearly 10 minutes, cycling through colors and patterns with mathematical precision, and then they did something they'd never done before. They projected an image, not just shadows and suggestions, but something clear and recognizable. Michael saw Earth, his planet, rendered in blue and green and white, floating in the darkness. He saw it from a perspective impossible for human eyes, from a distance that made the planet look small and fragile and precious. And then the image shifted. He saw other worlds, planets that weren't Earth, some barren and gray, others lush with colors that didn't exist in his spectrum of experience. He saw structures that might have been cities or ships or something entirely beyond his frame of reference. He saw movement, activity, suggestions of life and civilization and intelligence spread across distances that made his mind reel with their immensity. He was being shown something, being given context, being told that Earth wasn't unique, wasn't alone, was part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. The images faded, and the lights condensed back into a single sphere, larger and brighter than he'd ever seen it, descending until it hovered at eye level just beyond his porch. Michael stepped forward, Sargent close at his side, and looked into the light. He didn't touch it this time, didn't need to. The message was clear even without physical contact. This was acknowledgement. This was response to humanity's announcement, to the press conference, to the decision to go public with the evidence of their existence. The light pulsed once, brilliantly, illuminating the entire clearing in daylight brightness, and Michael felt something pass through him. Not information this time, but emotion. Gratitude, perhaps, or approval, or simply recognition. The sensation of being seen, truly seen by an intelligence that understood him in ways human comprehension couldn't quite achieve. And underlying it all was something else. Something that took Michael a moment to identify because it seemed so incongruous coming from an alien presence. Hope. That's what he felt emanating from the light. Hope for humanity, for the species that had finally acknowledged reality beyond their own limited perspective, that had taken the first genuine steps toward joining a larger community of conscious beings scattered across the cosmos. Hope that humans would prove worthy of the knowledge being offered, that they would grow and learn and eventually find their place among the civilizations that already existed in dimensions and distances humans were only beginning to comprehend. The light rose slowly, ascending through the falling snow, and Michael watched it climb until it disappeared among the stars, indistinguishable from the natural lights of the universe. But he knew the difference now. He could sense which lights were distant suns and which were something else, something closer and more aware, watching and waiting and hoping that humanity would make the right choices in the years and decades and centuries to come. He stood there long after the light was gone, snow accumulating on his shoulders and in his hair. Sargent pressed Warm against his leg, both of them looking up at the sky that had suddenly become so much more complex and full of possibility. The cold eventually drove him inside, but he didn't sleep that night. Instead, he transferred the footage to his laptop and sent it to Dr. Chen with a simple message. They came back. They responded. I think they're pleased." The response came within an hour despite the late hour. "We detected unusual atmospheric readings at your location tonight. Multiple monitoring stations picked up the signature. This wasn't just you, Michael. This was visible to our instruments, which means it was meant to be seen, meant to be verified. They're making it easier for us to believe, to accept, to study. Upload everything you recorded. We need to analyze this immediately." Over the following months, the lights continued to appear at various locations around the world, always to witnesses who'd been following the NASA announcement, who'd seen Michael's testimony, who were watching the sky with new awareness. The phenomena were no longer isolated to his mountain cabin. They'd gone global, as if the intelligence behind them had decided humanity was ready for broader contact, for more frequent encounters, for a gradual acclimation to the reality of non-human intelligence operating openly on Earth. NASA established a worldwide monitoring network, coordinating with space agencies and research institutions across every continent, tracking the phenomena, documenting their behavior, slowly building a more complete picture of what they were dealing with. Dr. Martinez published additional papers based on her contact experience, presenting mathematical frameworks that suggested ways to reconcile what she'd perceived with existing physical theories. Other scientists, initially skeptical, began replicating observations and confirming findings, and gradually a consensus emerged within the scientific community that something genuine and extraordinary was occurring. The public reaction was slower to coalesce. Some embraced the new reality enthusiastically, forming groups dedicated to studying and promoting awareness of the phenomena. Others retreated into denial or fear, unable or unwilling to accept that humanity's understanding of the universe needed such fundamental revision. Religious institutions struggled with the theological implications, some finding ways to integrate the new knowledge into existing frameworks, while others declared it demonic deception or elaborate hoax. But Michael, watching from his cabin in the mountains, saw the gradual shift in human consciousness that the lights seemed designed to facilitate. People were looking up more, paying attention to the sky, wondering about their place in the cosmos. Scientists were asking new questions, pursuing new lines of research, willing to consider possibilities they'd previously dismissed. And slowly, incrementally, humanity was adjusting to the truth that had always been there, but which they'd lacked the evidence or courage to acknowledge. 1 year after the initial NASA press conference, Michael received another call from Dr. Chen. "We're organizing an international conference on anomalous phenomena and potential non-human intelligence. Representatives from 40 countries, hundreds of scientists, government officials, military personnel. We want you to speak, to tell your story again, but this time to an audience that's prepared to really listen. Will you do it?" Michael looked at Sargent, who was sleeping peacefully by the fire, oblivious to the weight of the request his human had just received. A year ago, Michael would have refused, would have insisted his role was done, that he'd given his testimony and provided his evidence and could now return to the quiet life he'd sought in these mountains. But he'd changed over the past year. The encounters, the investigation, the public disclosure, all of it had pulled him out of isolation and reminded him that he was part of something larger than himself, part of humanity's collective journey toward understanding and growth. "Yes," he said. "I'll speak, but I want to bring Sargent. He was part of this from the beginning. He deserves to be there too." Dr. Chen laughed. "We'll make arrangements. Service dogs are always welcome, and Sargent might be the most important service dog in history. After all, he detected them first. He knew before any of us that something extraordinary was happening." The conference was held in Geneva, in a modern convention center that could accommodate the thousands of attendees who'd registered. Michael stood backstage, wearing the only suit he owned, Sargent groomed and wearing a vest that identified him as a working service dog, both of them about to walk onto a stage in front of an audience that represented the largest gathering of minds focused on this question in human history. He wasn't nervous anymore. He'd told his story so many times now that the words came naturally, and he'd learned that his value wasn't in eloquence or scientific expertise, but in simple authenticity, in being willing to stand up and say, "This happened to me. This is real. I'm not crazy and I'm not lying." He gave his speech and it was well received, but more important was what happened afterward. During the cocktail reception, he found himself surrounded by people who wanted to share their own experiences, their own sightings, their own moments of contact with the unexplained. Some were scientists with credentials as impressive as Dr. Martinez's. Others were ordinary people, farmers and teachers and truck drivers who'd seen lights in the sky or experienced phenomena they'd been too afraid to report until NASA's announcement made it safe to speak up. Michael listened to them all, and in their stories he heard echoes of his own journey from confusion to understanding, from isolation to connection. He realized that what had happened to him wasn't unique. He'd just been fortunate enough, or perhaps chosen deliberately, to have the right combination of circumstances, the right documentation, the right dog alerting at the right time, to become the focal point for humanity's acknowledgement of a reality that had always existed, but which they'd collectively refused to see. Late in the evening, after most attendees had departed, Michael stood on the terrace of the convention center with Dr. Martinez, both of them looking up at the night sky over Geneva. "Do you think they're watching right now?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm certain of it. Not just here, but everywhere. I think they're always watching, always observing, waiting to see how we develop, how we mature as a species. The question isn't whether they're watching, but what they'll do with what they observe. Will we pass whatever test they're administering? Will we prove ourselves worthy of whatever knowledge or relationship they're offering? And if we don't?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then I suppose they'll wait. They've been patient this long, patient enough to remain hidden or at least ambiguous until we developed the technology and social structures to handle the truth of their existence. They can wait longer if necessary. Time probably means something different to them than it does to us. But I think they're hopeful, Michael. I felt that during my contact, and I suspect you did too during yours. They want us to succeed. They want us to join them, whatever that means. We just have to prove we're ready." They stood there in comfortable silence, two humans among billions, looking up at a universe that had suddenly become so much more alive and aware than they'd ever imagined. And somewhere above them, invisible to ordinary sight but present nonetheless, the lights maintained their vigil, watching and waiting and hoping that humanity would find the wisdom and courage to take the next steps in their cosmic evolution. Michael returned to his cabin after the conference, but his life had changed permanently. He'd become a public figure despite his preference for privacy, the face of humanity's first contact with confirmed non-human intelligence. Media requests never stopped completely, though he'd gotten better at filtering them, accepting only the serious inquiries from journalists interested in truth rather than sensationalism. He'd also begun working with NASA in an official capacity, serving as a liaison between the scientific establishment and the growing community of contactees who'd experienced their own encounters with the phenomena. Sargent aged gracefully, the gray in his muzzle spreading as the years passed, but the dog remained alert to the lights whenever they appeared, which was less frequently now but still regular enough that Michael maintained his documentation protocols. The relationship between humanity and the phenomena evolved slowly, as these things must. More contact events occurred, more data was gathered, more papers were published, more theories were proposed, debated, refined, or discarded as understanding gradually deepened. 5 years after that first night when Sargent barked at a light no one else could see, Michael stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Sargent was beside him, older now, slower, but still present and aware. The dog had been there for every significant moment of this journey, had been the first to detect the impossible, had been brave when bravery was required and calm when calm was needed. Whatever recognition humanity received for making contact with non-human intelligence, Sargent deserved an equal share. As darkness fell, Michael felt the familiar presence before Sargent alerted. The light appeared, singular now rather than multiple, descending until it hovered before them at eye level. It had been months since the last appearance, and Michael had wondered if the phenomena were withdrawing, having accomplished whatever their purpose had been. But here it was again, pulsing with that gentle breathing rhythm, bathing them in blue-tinged luminescence. Michael didn't record this time, didn't reach for his phone or camera. He simply stood and observed, one hand resting on Sargent's head, both of them witnesses to a mystery that had transformed their lives and was gradually transforming their entire species' understanding of existence. The light pulsed brighter, and Michael felt that familiar sensation of being seen, of being recognized by an intelligence vast and ancient and fundamentally kind. And then he felt something new. Not information this time, not emotion, but something more like invitation, a sense that pathways were opening, that the gradual process of contact was entering a new phase, that humanity had passed some threshold of readiness and would soon be offered opportunities they'd only begun to imagine. He didn't know what form those opportunities would take, didn't know what challenges and wonders lay ahead. But standing there with his dog and the light and the mountains surrounding them in silent majesty, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years, not since before the war, before the trauma, before isolation became his default mode. He felt hope, not the desperate hope of someone drowning and clutching at straws, but the solid, grounded hope of someone who'd seen genuine evidence that the universe was more wonderful than fear suggested, that life was more widespread than loneliness implied, that consciousness was more connected than separation indicated. The lights were real, the intelligence behind them was real, and humanity, with all its flaws and conflicts and confusion, was being given a chance to grow beyond its limitations and join something larger. The light rose slowly, ascending through the darkening sky, and Michael watched until it disappeared among the stars. Sargent leaned against his leg, and Michael knelt down, wrapping his arms around the dog, pressing his face into the familiar fur, feeling gratitude for the companion who'd been with him through all of this, who'd detected the impossible before anyone else and given him the courage to investigate rather than dismiss. "Good boy," he whispered. "Such a good boy. You changed the world, Sargent. You changed everything." The dog's tail wagged slowly, and in that simple gesture, Michael saw reflected everything that mattered: loyalty, courage, trust, the willingness to alert when something demanded attention even if no one else could see it yet, the refusal to ignore the evidence of one's own senses even when that evidence contradicted everything previously understood. Sargent had been more than a service dog, more than a companion. He'd been a teacher, demonstrating through instinct and persistence that reality was larger and stranger than fear allowed humans to acknowledge. Inside the cabin, Michael's laptop chimed with incoming email, probably another interview request, or maybe update from NASA about new sightings, or perhaps message from one of the countless individuals who'd reached out over the years to share their own experiences with the unexplained. He'd read it later. Right now, in this moment, he wanted to simply be present, to stand in the gathering darkness with his dog and remember the journey that had brought them here, from that first night of confusion and fear to this current state of wonder and anticipation. The universe was vast. It was old. It was alive with intelligence and awareness in forms humanity was only beginning to recognize. And somewhere in the mountains of Washington State, a veteran and his dog had become the focal point for humanity's first genuine steps toward acknowledging that profound truth. It wasn't the end of anything. It was barely the beginning. But it was real. It was documented. And it had changed everything. Michael stood, his knees protesting slightly, reminding him that he was getting older too, that the years were passing and bringing change whether he welcomed it or not. But change wasn't always bad. Sometimes change opened doors, revealed possibilities, transformed isolation into connection and fear into wonder. He'd come to these mountains seeking escape from a world that had wounded him, seeking silence and solitude as balm for trauma that words couldn't heal. Instead, he'd found purpose. He'd found significance. He'd found proof that the universe was stranger and more beautiful than the darkness in his own mind suggested, that life persisted and adapted and reached across impossible distances to make contact, to communicate, to remind all conscious beings that separation was illusion and connection was the fundamental truth underlying all existence. As he and Sargent walked back into the warmth of the cabin, Michael looked one more time at the sky, at the stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds on velvet, and he smiled. Out there, somewhere among those distant lights, other minds were watching, other consciousness was aware, Other beings were pursuing their own journeys toward understanding, and Earth, his home, humanity's cradle, was no longer isolated or alone. They were part of the community now, however junior their membership, however much they still had to learn. The lights would return, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe not for months. But they would return, because the process had begun, because humanity had proven themselves capable of facing the truth rather than retreating into comfortable denial, because one man and one dog in one forest had been brave enough to look at something impossible and say, "This is real, this matters. This demands investigation and understanding rather than dismissal and fear." Michael Reed, veteran of foreign wars, survivor of trauma that should have broken him, resident of a cabin in mountains he'd chosen specifically for their distance from human complication, had become the man who changed everything. Not through conquest or genius or extraordinary talent, but simply through willingness to trust his own experience, to document carefully, to persist despite doubt, and to eventually share what he'd discovered with a world that desperately needed to know it wasn't alone. And Sergeant, a German Shepherd mix with graying muzzle and knowing eyes, a service dog trained to help veterans manage their trauma and reconnect with the world, had proven that sometimes the most important service a dog can provide is alerting to the impossible, barking at lights no one else can see yet, insisting through persistent canine stubbornness that there are more things in heaven and earth than human philosophy has yet imagined. Together, they'd opened a door that could never be closed again. Together, they'd given humanity a gift it hadn't known it needed. Together, they'd proven that one life, one moment of courage, one decision to investigate rather than ignore, could change the course of history and transform humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it had barely begun. But standing in his cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth, his dog settling onto the rug with a contented sigh, Michael felt something he'd thought war had taken from him forever. He felt peace. Not the peace of escape or avoidance, but the peace of purpose fulfilled, of service rendered, of duty performed to the best of his ability despite fear and doubt and the immense weight of impossible responsibility. He'd been chosen, or perhaps he'd simply been in the right place at the right time with the right companion and the right willingness to see what others might have dismissed. Either way, he'd done what needed to be done. He'd witnessed the impossible, documented it carefully, shared it bravely, and watched as humanity slowly, incrementally, began to wake up to the reality of a universe far more alive and aware than their limited perspective had previously allowed them to understand. And that, Michael thought as he settled into his worn leather chair with a book he probably wouldn't be able to focus on, was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Outside, the mountain night continued its ancient rhythms, unaware and uncaring about the dramas of human consciousness and cosmic contact playing out within one small cabin. The wind moved through the trees. The creek murmured its eternal song. And far above, invisible to human eyes but present nonetheless, the lights maintained their watch, patient and curious and endlessly hopeful that the species they'd chosen to contact would prove worthy of the knowledge being offered, would grow into their potential, would eventually take their place among the civilizations that already thrived across the inconceivable distances and dimensions of a universe humanity was only beginning to truly see.